Years ago, I was a freshman at the University of Houston in Houston, Texas, which is, believe me, a tough place to be in environment. And I and one of my fellow freshmen were co-chairs of Earthworks, the campus ecology club, and it was time for the second Earth Day. We had participated in the first Earth Day by putting a memorial wreath on the Houston Ship Channel, which had recently caught fire. And but this second Earth Day was a lot like this. In fact, the program looked almost exactly like this program. The date's even the same, April 17th through the 22nd. So it's an almost identical program to this. And on one of those days, a bunch was piled into a car and drove out to the airport to pick up our featured speaker. And we had seen him listed in a list of suggested Earth Day speakers. And he was a chemistry professor from the University of Wisconsin, one of those chemists who realized that maybe we weren't getting better living through chemistry. Maybe we were getting a lot of problems with chemistry as well. And so we went out and picked up our speaker, Doug LaFollette, Professor Doug LaFollette, chemist again. And he told us a lot of things, probably not so very different from what he's going to tell us tonight. What he's going to do is build on that Earth Day from 35 years ago. Sort of talk about the trends since that Earth Day 25 years ago. And in that interim, he decided that you could do a lot more for the Earth through politics than through chemistry. And so he ran for, I believe it was the state senate in Wisconsin. He was a state senator for a while. He has served as the Wisconsin Secretary of State for many years. I think he ran for a few other offices, either national senator or governor or something or other. But he's been in this interesting role as the Secretary of State, which is something of an ombudsman and chair of the Land Commission, and has a number of other responsibilities. And has felt that he has been able to make a difference in that position. And it's certainly given him the bully pulpit to go around the state of Wisconsin and talk about environmental issues and how they tie into the economy and a whole host of issues. He also founded an environmental group, one of the first statewide, very influential environmental groups called Wisconsin's Environmental Decade, funded that in 1970, because I believe that he and the co-founders said, if we don't get things right this decade, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. This is the decade where we have to get on the right path. And so many decades later, they're now called Clean Wisconsin, right? And they're still trying to get us on the right path in Wisconsin. So I'm going to allow Doug to fill in any gaps that I have not covered, but 35 years I've known this guy.
And the same, thank you, the same.
You're very influential in the path that I chose in my life, and I might not be an environmental studies professor at the University of Montana today, if not for what I heard him say 35 years ago at that second Earth Day.
Well, thank you. Professor Watson.
You put on all your
well, I'm using a mic which is all wired up, so you can hear me fine? Good. If you can't, way back in there, you be my monitor. The only thing that with her permission, I'll say Vicki rather than Professor Watson, left out is I'm also at the moment a national board member for Sierra Club. And I've worked for the Union Concerned Scientists in Washington as Public Affairs Director, so I've done a good amount of NGO work as well as education work as well as politics. And of course those are the three places where we have to work if we're going to do something about the earth. And I've had a little bit of effort in all of them. The Sierra Club has taken on some new serious goals involving energy issues that I'll talk some about. And I've got some material from the Sierra Club as well as some other organizations, Natural Resources Defense Council and some other people that are on the forefront of what's developed over the last 30-some years. It was kind of amazing when I landed here at 1 o'clock yesterday in a snowstorm, and Vicki picked me up, same as 35 years ago. It seemed like an amazing sort of a deja vu. I thought what I'd do tonight is just go through several little snippets of things, any one of which I could talk about for several hours, as you can imagine. It's always dangerous to have a professor politician speaking, because they're both famous for going on and on. So I'm going to just go through several little minuets of things, and then maybe you'll see how it all fits together. The first thing, which is appropriate, is a little bit of a brief history of Earth Day. And again, this is something that when I used to teach Ecology 101, the first environmental class at the University of Wisconsin, I put together and designed it back in 69 and 70. And I wanted to call it the science of survival. But you know how administrations at universities are. That didn't sound good. So we had to call it Ecology 101. And I taught that to several hundred students for several semesters. And it was a very interesting course. It's science, economics, sociology, psychology, and political science all together. So here's the history. After World War II, there was a tremendous amount of pent-up demand and a whole lot of new technology. So in the 1950s and 60s, the American system cranked up and started producing large quantities of much stuff. Automobiles, televisions, chemicals, pesticides, all kinds of things that didn't really exist in the 1930s. And during the war years, Second World War, for those of you who are too young to know, we were very busy. But after that, all this new technology suddenly was applied to consumerism. And guess what? There were no environmental regulations, because no one had thought about that, obviously. So by the late 60s, this had led to a situation where it had gotten pretty bad. And I call the first stage of the modern environmental movement the black smoke, or the dead fish, because that's what it was like. The Fox River, all the fish had died. There were big power plants near my campus and all around Wisconsin and the country that were spewing out black smoke. I could have my students go out with their little vials and collect green, yellow gook coming out of factory pipes. And people could smell it, they could taste it. And for a few of you with a gray hair or two, you can remember. I mean, it got really bad, 68, 69. The famous Cuyahoga River caught fire, etc. And I won't go on about that. But because of that, there was a need to do something. Senator Gaylord Nelson, this is the first Earth Day without him. He died just a couple of months ago. He was a governor in Wisconsin and a great conservationist. That's what people were called then, conservation. And he did a lot of great things as governor. And then he was elected U.S. Senator and went to Washington. And after a couple of years there, he became very frustrated that his fellow senators didn't pay a whole lot of attention to him when he started talking about environmental issues. Air pollution, water pollution, protecting the wilderness, protecting the great and beautiful lakes of our country, etc. So he was a very charismatic and a great person, one of my heroes, as you can tell. Took a model of the teach-ins on the Vietnam War that were going on. Because in that period, all across the country, on campuses, students and professors were having teach-ins to protest the war in Vietnam. And he said, why not use that model for a national teach-in on environment? So he called around to a few campuses, found out when spring breaks were and so forth, and he went across the country finding people like me to help, and I worked on it in the Midwest, and other people worked on it in other places. And on April 22nd, 1970, pretty much the country, at least the academic community, high schools, grade schools, sort of shut down for a day, and we showed films and talked about environment. And it was a very inspiring event. And it was an event that worked, because out of that event, there was enough public awareness raised that he and other people, like Senator Mansfield, one of your hero senators, were able to pass in Washington the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Protection Act, all within a period of 4, 5, 6 years in the middle 70s. That was a very exciting period, and we felt very optimistic. And I formed the Wisconsin Environmental Decade, and here in Montana you formed the Something Environmental Council, which still exists, to work on statewide environmental issues, and those were kind of good times. and I could talk a lot about it, but that was the first stage, a very positive time. Well, by the mid-'80s, we began to discover that there were much more complicated problems. For example, the fish came back to the Fox River and many other places because we built sewage treatment plants and no longer flushed our toilets directly. Therefore, the biological demand, the BOD, dropped down, and the eutrophication began to be less serious, and the fish could breathe again, and they came back. But you can't eat the fish. In Wisconsin and most every state in the country, there are fish advisories. Don't eat the fish because of mercury, because of PCBs, because of the different chemicals that are in those fish. Fish are back, but you can't eat them. The smokestacks no longer had black smoke. And that was good because they installed electrostatic precipitators that took out the soot. And the power companies screamed and yelled, we can't do it, it'll bankrupt us. And I debated a couple power company presidents, and they finally, we passed a law, they put them on, it didn't bankrupt them. They scream that way all the time. And no more black smoke. But coming out of those smokestacks was sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon dioxide that we now talk about. But we didn't even think about those things in the late 60s. Well, here's just a little quick list of some of the environmental issues that began to be serious in the 80s and on to the last part of the 1980s. Certainly acid rain, the ozone hole opening, the issue of toxic chemicals. One of another heroes of mine is a woman named Theo Colborn, Dr. Colborn. She came back to grad school as an adult after raising a family and ended up in Madison, where she got her PhD, which is where I also got to know Professor Watson, who got her PhD in Madison. And Theo Colborn, at age 50-some, getting her PhD, was talking to other biologists. She was a biology student. And they began to sort of compare notes that there were, in the Great Lakes area primarily, there were female birds with testicles and male fish with ovaries. There was something wrong within the endocrine systems of the reproduction of fish and birds, for sure. So she put together a 2-year study, out of which came a book that she wrote with some other people called Our Stolen Future. And I recommend it to you. It's not a very fun book, but it's a very carefully researched book on the impacts of these chlorofluorocarbons on the reproductive systems of at least birds and fish, and we're not quite sure about people. If someone asks Theo, what about us? She says, we don't know. So that's another whole area that was never even considered an environmental issue back in the late 60s. And final, the one that's so popular now, if you want to think about it as popular, and that's the climate issue. And there's kind of a fun controversy about that. Global warming is the name that first got attached to it. And I remember I had a debate for running for office back, now it's been almost 10 years ago, because this issue's been around quite a while, although it takes some people longer than others to catch on. Everybody, I think, now agrees that climate disruption is a problem, except possibly Exxon and President Bush. And other than those two groups, I think there's no one else who now disagrees. So people were calling it global warming. And my opponent said, well, global warming is a pretty good thing. Here in Wisconsin, it gets pretty damn cold. We'd like some warming. And Montana may feel the same way. So based on that and talking to some friends of mine at Stanford and Harvard who work a lot on this issue, they told me they prefer climate disruption. That's really what's going on. Some places are getting colder, some are hotter, some are wetter, some are drier. They had the coldest years in winter in Siberia and Russia. They had like 40-some feet of snow in some Japanese places. We have major droughts, we have major floods, hurricanes are getting more powerful. But the common vernacular is probably going to be global warming for a while. The Sierra Club that works on this issue seriously has found that global warming seems to pull better with people. They kind of relate to it. So we have trouble going over to using the term climate disruption. But I think it's important to know kind of the background of that. And no one talked about global warming or climate disruption in the 60s and early 70s. So that got us into what I call the second stage of the modern environmental movement. And I call that it ain't as easy as we thought it was going to be. And it's kind of a long thing, but you see my point. These issues I just talked about are much more complex. They're much more systemic. They're much more difficult to fix than the black smoke or the dead fish. And the people that could run our society got pretty nervous when some of us started talking about the things that would have to be done to deal with these issues, because they involve major changes in lifestyle, major changes in how we function as a consumer society, and how we recycle or don't recycle, what we produce. You can see that these were very sticky issues. And they got nervous, and they began to organize, and they have now succeeded with a lot of propaganda and misinformation, etc., that I'll talk about in a moment, to move us into what I call the third stage of the environmental movement. And we've been there now for about 10 years. I call it the backlash. We now have a serious backlash. In Washington right now, the most anti-environmental president, the most anti-environmental Congress are trying to turn back the laws that Gaylord Nelson and Senator Mansfield and Senator Church and Senator McGovern and some of the leaders of that time were able to pass. And that's kind of a scary thing that we have to face. And that's where we are now, in the backlash. So that's kind of a brief history. Now, the second thing I want to do is tell a story that was a great revelation to me when I heard Rob Stein tell this story. And if you want more than I'm going to give you in my little 5 minutes or so, you can look up Rob Stein on the Google machine, you know, you can do that, and he's written articles on this. He used to work in Washington as a political activist type, and he decided he wanted to look into this question. And a question that I'm sure a good number of you have also lived through. And when I heard him structure this in a way that was very clear, I just went, wow, that's exactly right. And it's very scary. And here's what Rob Stein says. He explains this with 4 big circles. And the first of those circles is money. Over the last 20-some years, the very wealthy, super conservative people in this country, like Mr. Coors in Colorado, Mr. Kohler in Wisconsin, you may have a few here, have contributed over $200 million a year into this effort. With that money, the second circle is what I call the educational circle. Quotation marks on education. They set up the Cato Institute, the Heartland Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, and many other of these think tanks, which are not peer-reviewed. This is an academic audience, so I don't need to explain peer review to you. They hire a few people with PhDs who are willing to work for them, and they crank out all this mumbo-jumbo, pseudo-science misinformation. And they send it all over the place. I get it all the time. As an elected person, they send it to me. And they've got an unlimited amount of money to spread around. I get one called Climate News that's talking about there's no problem. They have them on education, they have them on taxes, on any issue where they want control, they do these little position papers and so forth. They also set up a school to train conservatives. In fact, Karl Rove was one of the first students to go through this, and they've trained over 200 young conservative activists on how to organize in this country. The third circle is the media. And that's everything from Rush Limbaugh and all of his clones. I'm sure you've got one in Missoula. We've got one in Madison, one in Milwaukee, on talk radio, all the time, putting out this kind of stuff and all other kinds of sort of mush that too many people get most of their news from this source. And then you've got the Fox network. The Fox network was also a new phenomenon that is strongly supported by the conservative wealthy people who wanted to react to this, what was going on. See, they were very nervous because this all kind of started, for those of you who like history, after the '64 defeat of Goldwater. When Goldwater was defeated, he was kind of the hero of the conservative movement, although, quite honestly, Mr. Bush kind of makes Goldwater look like a Sierra Club member. I don't know, but it's pretty interesting. So they were nervous because there was a civil rights movement, there was a women's rights movement, there was an environmental movement, there was an anti-war movement. All the stuff in the 60s kind of made them say, well, wait a minute, we're not quite sure we like where this is going. We better do something. So they did. They raised the money, they put out this propaganda, and they got control of media. But still, they needed something else. And that's what we call the ground troops. Because what these people wanted, think about it, They didn't really care whether gay people got married or whether women had the right to choose or whether we protected the wilderness places. They wanted two things: their taxes cut and no regulation. That was their agenda. But they couldn't sell that to the American public. We're smarter than that. We're going to say, well, wait a minute. So they needed to activate somebody. So they found groups like the National Rifle Association, the Christian Right, the Farm Bureau, conservative organizations that had these kind of hot-button issues that they could exploit to get them out to knock on doors and to do things to win elections. And of course, if you'll note, when they've won these elections, what are the two things that they do? Cut the taxes for the millionaires and get rid of the regulation. But they have been able to use this system to basically, as one person told me when I gave this talk, to hijack our country. And that's exactly what's happened. So they took power over this 20-year period. Well, let me change again and talk a little bit about our current predicament. What is the environmental state of affairs? Well, it's nothing very new, and I like what Vicki said, that I may give the same speech that she heard as a freshman at the university 35 years ago. And I used to teach this course, and I'm not going to keep you here for a whole semester, but basically the course that I taught, there we go, can all be explained with one equation. And it's the iPad equation. And around that you can structure the whole environmental situation. And what this stands for is, this is the impact on the environment. The impact we have as we live. The resources we take and the waste that we discharge, everything we do. Now, can you eliminate that? No, of course not. We have to live and we have an impact. The issue is, how big will this be, and will it be sustainable? Will the Earth be able to absorb that impact and be around 50, 100, 200 years to continue to do that? There's a certain regeneration ability of the living Earth, if you will, but if you overload that, you get in trouble. And then species go extinct, coral reefs disappear, systems collapse. So the question is how we can minimize this. Well, to do it, we need to understand where it comes from, and it comes from three different factors. The first factor, and probably the most important, is population. The more people, the more impact. It's pretty obvious. And just to put this in perspective, in 1970, when I gave my first Earth Day talk, there were 3.8 billion people on the Earth. Now, in 2006, there are about 5.9 billion. And it's going up at about 2.4 per second. Every second I'm talking, there are 2.4 more people. That's born minus die. That's about 74 million new people on the Earth every year. So that's something one has to think about. In the United States, back in the 1970s, it was around 200 million, and now it's almost 300 million. As Gaylord Nelson said in talks he gave fairly recently, until he had poor health the last 6 months and died, he said, since the first Earth Day, we've added 100 million people to this country. And things weren't very good then, and now we have to worry about it. So this is a key issue, but it's one that people don't want to talk about because it involves birth control, sex education, abortion, all the things that politicians don't find very comfortable. But the truth of the matter is, one cannot ignore it. If I did not mention that, I would not be true to the reality of the situation. Well, the second issue is affluence. How rich you are, or whatever that means. Well, the trouble with affluence is it's kind of how you define it. Too many people define affluence as how big a home they live in. In 1970, the average home was about 1,200 square feet. Then it went up to 15, 18, 2,000, 2,500. Now many new homes are 3,000 square feet. They have 3-car garages. I mean, the typical home, 3-car garages. And all kinds of other stuff that we have decided we have to have. From garbage disposals to Hummers to diet dog food, to heated Greyhound racetracks. I can go on and on with examples of what we have decided makes us affluent. And of course, it's all into consumption and the system that produces that. Now, when I go to the beach in Milwaukee or Kenosha, and on many days they close them because of human excrement in the water because of overflows of sewage plants that we haven't kept up to date because we've cut the taxes and there's no money in Washington to take care of our schools and our bridges and our health care and our environment and our national parks and our sewage treatment plants. That doesn't make me feel very affluent. When we have in Milwaukee and most urban areas an epidemic of lung diseases among children. I mean, emphysema and asthma are at epidemic levels among kids. I don't feel very affluent when large numbers of children in urban areas are suffering from asthma. So it's all a matter of how you measure it. And the sad thing is in this country, and in most of Europe and Japan and probably New Zealand a little bit and Australia, we've gotten off on a very dangerous track with affluence. And again, you can imagine I could go on a whole day or two on that subject because but you see the point. And just one little footnote. The scary thing is most of the rest of the world can't wait to catch up with us because they think this is great. And we've told them it's great. It's pretty hard to say, hey, now, we made a mistake. We need to start saying that to people. For example, in China, where there are about 1.25 billion people, they now are developing. And they are putting a tremendous demand on resources. That's one reason why oil prices are so high. And you can't buy plywood, you can't buy cement, because China's buying all they can. In Beijing, China, every day they license 1,000 new cars. 1,000 new cars a day are put on the road. About 2 years ago, the mayor of Beijing put out a statement saying, we've got to get the cars off the streets because they're getting in the way of the bicycles. Well, you can imagine that. Think of the politics of that. People, the new rich Chinese that are driving cars have more political clout than the folks running around their bicycles. Sounds like home, right, doesn't it? But you can see the point. If they try to achieve happiness through the kind of affluence that we have chosen, the earth is in deep doo-doo, I tell you. The third point is technology. And that's basically, and again, this could be a long discussion, of the tools we choose to provide what we need. And we have certain needs. Electricity, maybe too much of it, some heat, et cetera, clothes, transportation. And again, this could be a whole 2 or 3 weeks of discussion to analyze this, but let me just give you 2 quick examples. The first one, I'll talk about apples. We like to eat apples. Now, am I against apples? No, I love apples. I'm going to have one for dessert probably after my talk. The question is how you transport those apples. I hear that people sometimes grow apples in the banana belt of Montana. That's what you call it. I haven't seen any bananas out there in the streets. When I landed at the airport in the snowstorm, I didn't see any banana trees. But you know what I mean. And in Wisconsin, we grow apples, and we ship them places. Let's say apples from Missoula have to go to Kansas City where they don't grow apples. How do you get the apple there? Well, there's 2 ways, either by truck or by train. And the apple doesn't care, and you don't care either. But I tell you, it takes 5 times as much fuel and causes 5 times as much air pollution to ship that apple by truck. And yet we have become a total truck society. Go out on any major highway, any time of night or day, and you'll see, I don't know, 1 million trucks on the road at one time. I have no idea. And that's a choice of technology that we have made. Another example would be what you do with that apple core when you're through with it. What do most U.S. people do? They go over and they drop it in something called garbage disposal, and they turn the water on. They go and they grind it up and send it into the local Clark Fork River or into Lake Mendota in Madison, because that's where it ends up. You pay taxes to treat water at a treatment plant, then you run it to your house, you use electricity from a coal-burning plant, which is causing sulfur dioxide and climate change. You have all the steel and copper to build this thing that comes out of strip mines around the world, and then you ship it to a sewage treatment plant where you pay more taxes to try to clean it up, but you don't clean it up completely because the fertilizer value is still there. That gets dumped in the water and it causes eutrophication and problems there. Now, isn't that a crazy way to deal with apple cores and lots of other organic waste? That's a technological choice. I call them water pollution machines, and I would ban them. If I could vote in Congress, I'd vote to ban garbage disposal. I wouldn't ban apples, but I would ban garbage disposals. Choices. And we have to learn to make those choices. Now, what is the alternative technology to garbage disposals? Composting. And some of you do it in your own backyards. In big urban areas, it may be difficult, but there are municipalities that are doing it at a municipal level. when they collect the bottles and they collect the paper, they can collect the organics and take them out to a landfill where they can be properly handled and they decompose fine. You've got to keep out toxics and things like that, but the organic material will work. Well, again, I could go on a lot, but you see the point. We make choices about the level at which we want to consume and the number of people that are doing the consumption, and until we start learning to make those choices in a more sound way, we are going to have some environmental trouble. Okay, let me change subjects, not change subjects, sort of go on to another little tack. Today's news, if you watch it, you hear about everything from the coral reefs are dying. We have peak oil. Many articles now about peak oil. You see these graphs on the paper going up. U.S. oil peaked a number of years ago. That means the amount of oil being discovered is less than the amount of oil being consumed. So you're over the hill and it's all downhill from there as far as oil. When will world oil peak? Well, we're not exactly sure. And they can debate it. Depends on what you mean by oil, oil shale, heavy oil, Venezuelan oil, etc. But it's going to peak, and that's made a lot of news recently, and gas prices are going up, etc. Natural gas prices have doubled. Polar bears are not reproducing. News. What's that got to do with it? Well, polar bears are having trouble because of climate disruption issues. Because polar bears, it turns out, can outrun a seal on ice. But a seal can outswim a polar bear in the water. So as the ice is melting, there's less time for female polar bears to get enough food that they are healthy enough to conceive or not miscarry when they become pregnant. And that's a problem with any mammal. Female mammal who doesn't get enough nourishment is not able to reproduce well. We have major floods, we have droughts. There's no question something's going on. And at the same time, as I mentioned, population is going up at 2.4 per second. So there's some sort of a semi-little crisis here on the agenda, and what are we going to do about it? Well, I certainly think that one can be very pessimistic about all this, and I am to some extent, but I'm going to, and I could go on at great length, but I'm going to kind of come up with a couple little conclusions here, and then maybe let's have some dialogue, and I'll try to answer questions. One thing I learned from my hero, Senator Nelson, who I've mentioned, and he certainly does deserve the respect of being mentioned. And when he first did this years ago, he was a great speaker. I caught this. He said, I'll try to answer your questions. And I've always thought that was very good, because too many of us say, okay, now I'll answer your questions. I'm not sure I can answer your questions. So Gaylord Nelson taught me that. So I'll try to answer your questions or hear some of your comments. But as I sort of wrap this up, let me do three things. First of all, show you a bumper sticker that I carry around. I've got several of these. And it says conservation voters. And I've got another one in here that I'm very happy about, which says, I vote the environment. This is the Sierra Club version of that same thing. And that is why I started the Wisconsin Environmental Decade, which was a political environmental group. That's why I left the university and ran for public office. And I still think that that's something that after 30-some years we haven't quite got yet. And I think that's partly what these folks understood. Because no matter how strong you feel about whatever issue you care about, the environment or education or women's rights or whatever it may be, if you don't win, it's all over. And we progressive people, I make the assumption that you're progressive people. There may be one or two people who are not, came to listen to me, and I thank you. But we progressive people have got to learn to work together more cohesively if we're going to take back power. That's my first little thought. My second one is a story by another one of my heroes. His name is Brock Evans. Brock Evans was a Sierra Club activist, vice president of the club, ran for Congress unsuccessfully, as I did. I got blown away with millions of dollars in the campaign when I ran for both U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Brock Evans is now the head of the Endangered Species Coalition, which is a coalition nationwide that I hope you'll all support. Go on their website. You can send them a little bit of money if you like. They're fighting to protect the endangered species law that Gaylord Nelson and other people passed, that people like Congressman Pumbo would like to destroy. Pumbo is that crazy jerk from Southern California who thinks he wants to eliminate the Endangered Species Act and a bunch of other stuff. but we may beat him this year. There's another Republican running against him in a primary who's quite a good person. And I really hope that fellow will win, and then we'll have a good member of Congress from that area. Here's what Brock Evans said to me. We were sitting around in Washington, D.C., about 6 of us from different environmental groups, sort of like this, a few years ago, and pretty discouraged. And Brock can be an amazing optimist. I just love him for it. He said, Doug, we've got to keep fighting. And this is my message to you. I mean, I'm still fighting, and you have got to start and keep doing it as well. One time after an interview, after a speech like this, a radio reporter came up to me with her microphone. And she was obviously fairly young, maybe still a journalism student or something. And she said to me, Secretary LaFollette, I just heard your speech, and I'd like to ask you one question. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? Well, I had to think a minute. That's a trick question. And I said, well, I'm sort of a desperate optimist. And I still feel that way. I mean, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't an optimist. I still am fighting, as you need to, and Brock Evans will tell you his story. But I'm desperate because we have to do something serious. So Brock said this to me, and I say it to you from him. We have to look at ourselves as the guardians of a portal to the future. And it's our job to drag through that portal every acre we can, to push through every species we can, to give choices to our children and grandchildren. Because when those acres are destroyed, when those species become extinct, the choices for the future are no longer. Therefore, we, living today and tomorrow and next year, are the guardians to that portal to the future, and it's our job to keep the option as open as we can for that future. And that inspired me when Brock told me that, how he goes to bed at night and gets up in the morning, and I wanted to share that with you. Let me end by saying I can be a bit optimistic in this regard. I see a little bit of a corollary between 1968 and 69 and today, in the sense that then we had the black smoke, the dead fish. It was getting pretty bad, and we got people's attention. We had a Gaylord Nelson, and we had a Mike Mansfield, and there were leaders then, which we don't have very many now. But today, with the climate disruption / global warming issue, which is making headlines, which is getting people's attention, Time magazine is on the cover, I think that we're in that sort of a potential tipping point, crisis point situation where change can be possible. If we get some leadership, and if we ourselves organize through our organizations, through our Rotary clubs and our high schools and our churches, and with all the different people we can partner with and work with to make the kind of changes to take back our country for the kind of progressive beliefs that I think we all share, whether it be the environment, or education, or healthcare, or protecting the infrastructure of our country, or balancing the budgets so our grandchildren are not bankrupt. You know, when Bush was elected, we were in the black and going ahead positively. Now we have the giant debt and we're totally bankrupt. So we can't afford to fix our parks or clean up our air or provide education support for college students. We've got to make those changes. And I think we can do it, but it's going to be a lot of work. And I'll keep at it, and I want you to join. With that, I really thank you, and I will try to answer any questions or be glad to hear your comments and points of view. You've got a couple of disasters and one so-so. If you look at your scores for your 3 members of Congress.
So before we take any questions, please note that there are several groups that have tables set up right outside the lecture hall here, and they have information on things that you can do if you'd like to work with them and work on some issues.
And I'll leave things in here for you to take a look at them. And I got a couple extras, but if not, you can find the websites and places to get this kind of material. I will ask you to speak loudly because this big room I have trouble hearing. Sure.
Speaking of leadership, you have to take that on the curve nominee for the Secretary of the Interior, Governor Ken Ford versus the outgoing Secretary.
Well, I mean, people are trying to paint him as kind of a moderate, but if you look at the record, that's not true. And there was just a very interesting little spot on public radio as I was having supper a little bit ago talking about the exact point. But he'll be confirmed, and we'll have to watch him and we'll have to sue him. I mean, there's some very good groups out there, including the Sierra Club and the Earth Justice and the Center for Biological Diversity that try to keep our current government as honest as we can keep them. sir?
Do you have just five, wrote a number, legislative reforms that you think could be a small difference, a step in the right direction?
That's interesting. Could you hear the question? I'm not sure about five. I can think of one that I didn't mention that is probably very important and very difficult, and that's campaign finance reform. Because until we get the big money out of politics, it's going to be hard to do a whole lot about electing better men and women. And we have a real stumbling block. It's called the First Amendment. And I don't know how much you want to get history and political science, but many years ago, after the Watergate kind of scandals, Congress passed a campaign finance law. And it limited campaign contributions and it limited campaign spending. And a senator named James Buckley brought a lawsuit challenging that, and it became Buckley versus Vallejo, because Vallejo was the government person to enforce that. And it became a very famous case that we're still stuck with. And Buckley versus Vallejo, the Supreme Court ruled that spending money equals free speech. Therefore, my ability to speak is through my money. So if I'm a multimillionaire and I want to spend millions of dollars on TV ads or whatever, you can't limit that free speech. Now, I don't agree, but I'm not a lawyer, but I know many people, the Brennan Center for Justice, for example, and many other progressive legal groups don't agree with it. We've tried to challenge it other times. The court's getting worse, so it's harder to be optimistic that that can be overturned. The court did say you can limit campaign contributions, but not spending. Now, the way that people have gotten around that in places like Maine, Minnesota, Arizona, Wisconsin, we're trying, we haven't gotten there yet, is to pass a voluntary spending limit and to back that voluntary limit up with public financing. So if two of us are running for office and you agree to the public to limit your spending to a fixed amount for governor or whatever, then you get public financing from tax money to run your campaign. If I don't choose to do it and I spend more than the limit, then some of the laws subsidize him to keep up with my level of spending that I'm getting from special interests. And so that's kind of an experimental thing that some states are trying, and it's one way to get around the Buckley versus Vallejo First Amendment argument on limiting campaign spending. But that's one of the major reforms that I think we need to talk about in this country if we're going to make progress against what big money would like to buy. I can't think of four other ones in a big hurry. I mean, I think the most important thing now is to be on the defense politically against the dismantling of the good environmental laws. But knowing the situation in Washington, we need to work at the local and state level, because there are good things happening there. Montana had a real step forward a year and a half ago in your elections. And your governor has taken some pretty gutsy stands on things like Bush is full of baloney on a couple stuff about the environment. And Colorado had real step forward in their last election. And other states are limiting mercury and are dealing with CO2 issues and are talking about cool cities. Dozens and dozens of mayors have declared their cities to be potential cool cities. We have to now see if they're going to do it. Cool cities is a Sierra Club term. I don't want to use inside talk, but we're supporting this effort to get mayors to sign up to agree to try to reduce their energy consumption / CO2 production in their cities. And we want to get as many cities to try to do that as possible. So I think another thing we can do is work at those levels where politically we have more opportunity at the present time. And I guess another thing is the old-fashioned education issue. If we agree that this is what it's really all about, a certain amount of regulation can make progress, but it's really a lifestyle education concept as to how we raise our children, what we talk about in our Rotary clubs and our church groups and our Chamber of Commerce meetings, to educate our fellow U.S. citizens as to what is important in life and how they can live their lives, and whether they should ride bicycles or whether they should, demand that we go to shipping by trains, and all the things you can think of. Because we as consumers and as citizens have a big impact. And that's a movement that is going on all across this country in different little pockets and pieces, from organic co-ops to church groups organizing on climate change and endangered species issues, hunter and angler groups, that you might think initially would be hostile. We find that there are a few lunatics out there who want to carry machine guns around to go hunting from snowmobiles, but the majority of hunters are rational people that love the outdoors, and we can work with them. We can work with Trot Unlimited and groups who share the values that we have. And I think those are the kind of things that I would put on my little list of 5 kind of things that we can work on to do. Sir.
Looking at your 4 circles up there, would you say that it's worthwhile to focus in on one particular one for organizing? And if it is, which one? Or should we be looking at a different model to approach solving our problems?
This is a tough question. I was asked this the other day, as to what we can do to replicate this. And Rob Stein's answer to that, when I heard him speak, was, well, we can't really replicate it probably. But we have to look at some sort of parallel model for the progressive movement in this country. And I know that he's making efforts, as other people are, and there are wealthy funders who are progressive, and they are committed to put in millions of dollars to something. And the question is what? It's going to be very hard to deal with these circles. The education is what we've got to do ourselves, because we're not going to be able to set up a Rush Limbaugh network. When Jim Hightower from Texas, one of my heroes, tried to do sort of progressive talk radio, it doesn't work. You know why? We don't want to be told what to do. We're thinking, thoughtful, progressive people. It's those lockstep conservatives that love to hear the same spiel over and over again, So you can't get enough sponsors because no one will listen to a Jim Hightower. I'm using this kind of symbolic. So we can't take over progressive talk radio. Public radio is in trouble sometimes in Washington. So I think the real issue is what we can do here. And I just mentioned that a minute ago, so I won't bore you with a lot of detail. The Sierra Club is a great grassroots organization. The National Wildlife Federation is. The Audubon Society is. Many church groups, the progressive churches that understand the reality of climate change are groups. The Trot Unlimited people. So we have the ground troops, but we haven't organized them and we haven't made common bond with them. And that's what I think we can do. So I don't think there's any one circle. Possibly that last circle is the one where we have the most potential as grassroots organizing people.
See any kind of correlation between environment and media reform? Specifically trying to get the equal time clause and the field and then.
Yeah, that would be great. You hear the question? Some sort of reform of the media to get equal time clauses back in where the media's got to give equal time and so forth. I'd love to have that happen, but that's really a political question. And until we elect some better people to go to Washington, we're not going to get that kind of reform, as we won't get the campaign finance reform. So, I mean, after 35 years, I'm just the same old boring person. We got to elect better people, damn it, because most everything we care about, other than this last point I made about the ground troops, with our own systems and our own organizations and working with partners, we can educate, but then the goal from that has to be, and this sounds kind of Machiavellian, but to take back power. And in this the democratic system of ours, power is the men and women we elect to the school board, the city council, and to go to Helena and to go to Washington, D.C. Yes, sir.
There is a reason that Senator Nelson chose the 22nd for Earth Day?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Why did Senator Nelson pick the 22nd? There's a cute story that I've heard him tell many times, and I'll tell it in his honor tonight. But first, to answer the question, I don't really know. I think it came about only as sort of a picking a time when campuses were there. So he tried to avoid spring breaks and pick a time when there weren't exams. So it was kind of almost sort of excluding and then what was left and okay. But here's the cute story. When he picked April 22nd and started organizing it, the John Birch Society organized a massive protest. And he was taken aback. Turns out April 22nd is Lenin's birthday. So the John Birch Society, unfortunately, which Holmes comes from Wisconsin and some folks there, were attacking him for this support of Lenin. And I'd love to have you hear Gaylord tell the story. He's so like, oh shucks. I said, well, I didn't know what to do. So I did some research, and I discovered that there are literally thousands and thousands of people whose birthday is on April 22nd. In fact, my Aunt Nellie's birthday is on April 22nd. So I assured the John Birch Society that this had nothing to do with Lenin. And he tells this little cute story. But it's true. I mean, the John Birch Society actually got all up in arms about April 22nd. But I don't know for sure, other than just it was a place when campuses were there and students were in a good time to organize. If you speak loud, way in the back.
Oh, yeah, I got a really big mouth.
I can't hear you.
I have the sense that Earth Day has largely been co-opted and is now so mainstream that it's just virtually meaningless. Do you think it's good when corporate America embraces Earth Day and groups like Weyerhaeuser say things like, every day is Earth Day? Or do you think that's bad?
Well, I definitely think we have to watch out for greenwashing and the co-opting of what we're trying to do. They'll try to do it. They're smart and they're well paid and they're organized. But it's up to us to make sure it doesn't happen. I don't see any co-opting going on in this room, and I don't think I'm going to see it on April 22nd where Professor Watson and her folks are doing things and making real efforts. Do we have to be alert? And do groups like the Sierra Club and other organizations have to watch out for this sort of thing and make sure that we point it out? Yes. And if they start doing good stuff, fine. But we have to watch them very carefully. And one good example, or there are two I can think of, one is the hybrid vehicle issue. Hybrid vehicles as a transportation make some sense. But when they're using hybrid vehicles now to up the horsepower for bigger and faster engines, we got to call them on that. Not all hybrids are good. And we got to start calling that when the auto company starts, hey, we're doing hybrids. You know, this hybrid is will go faster and bigger and more powerful. That isn't correct. And I can use other examples. One of my favorite examples is the ethanol issue. Growing corn to make ethanol to run our cars. And that's become a great boon now in the country. And Archer Daniel Midland, one of the big swine companies for their political behavior, they're getting millions in tax subsidy from your and my taxes to make this ethanol from the corn. And yet if you look at it carefully, the research of Professor Patek at Berkeley or Professor Pimentel at Cornell, it may be a loser, or at best it is a neutral when you look at all the gasoline, the petrol to run the tractors, the chemical fertilizers, the herbicides, the pesticides. Then you got to cook the corn. You know, all they're doing is what we used to do in Kentucky called moonshine. You know, you grind up some corn, you stew it up, and you distill it, and then you drink it. Well, now we're doing it in giant vats, and we're making ethanol to drive in cars. But that process of cooking that corn and distilling it more than once because of azeotropic mixtures of water and alcohol that, as a chemist I could teach you that you don't want to know about, it takes a heck of a lot of energy. And these professors have said it may be a wash or slightly better. But then you talk about the pollution of wells and groundwater from aldicarb. Growing corn is the most chemical intensive crop that we grow. And then you've got the air pollution from the plants that make it. People don't want to live downwind from these new ethanol plants. They're not the greatest thing in the world. And here's the final kicker. On the airplane, the way out here, I read this article. Originally, they started making ethanol from corn using natural gas to cook it, not to run the tractors. That's fossil fuel, like diesel fuel, and not to run the trucks. You can't put ethanol in pipelines, so you got to truck it. Therefore, more trucks, more gasoline. I mean, just every way you look. But natural gas prices have gone up. Did you notice on your bill? So the price of cooking corn with natural gas became prohibitive. Now there's a new ethanol plant in Illinois. It just started up. The plant burns 300 tons of coal a day making ethanol. And we all know that coal is the worst climate change gas because the way the molecule is structured, you get more CO2 per unit energy than you do out of oil or natural gas. So if you're going to burn tons and tons of coal to make ethanol, we got to take a step back. And I'm a little off your subject, but we've got to be very careful that the solutions and the propaganda really meets the good science. And you'll be happy to know that the Secretary of Energy just today or yesterday announced that he was dissolving the Science Advisory Committee to the Department of Energy. because the Bush administration does not need any science advice on energy. So they eliminated that group. A real step forward in our society. Okay, ma'am?
Are there companies green companies that people should invest in? I mean,
Yes.
And how do we find which?
Yeah, are there green companies that one should invest in? And invest could be two things. It could be buy their products, or it could be give them your extra money after you live to stocks or bonds. And yes, there are both. I'm not an expert at that, but there are people you can find that do that. There are green funds, a variety of different green funds that you can invest in. As far as buying products, you've got to be alert, but they're out there. There's one famous one, I can't remember his name at the moment, Vicki may know. He was a carpet manufacturer, and he got so concerned he decided, I'm going to make sure the carpet I make is 100% recyclable. I take it all back, they grind it, recycle it. Do you know his name? But he's become kind of a famous symbol of corporate America, because he was a pretty big company, no Exxon, but a serious national producer. And there are many other companies that are doing either okay or pretty good stuff. And part of it is because economics. I mean, the 3M company in Minneapolis is famous for doing good things, but they save money. Every time they revamp their electricity or change their production systems to use less energy, they save hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it makes good economic sense for companies to become much greener. So I think if you look around, and there are many books and articles and websites to help you do it. But yes, consumer decisions can be very important, and don't be afraid to squawk. I mean, I go into a place and I want a certain thing, I don't see it, I just say, hey, why don't you have thus or so? Why don't you have efficient products or whatever it may be, and I'm not going to buy what you have there, because the retailer is who we have to interface with, and that retailer will work it up the chain to the manufacturer if we can get them to be to do things greener. There are green architects that know how to design buildings. Back when Carter was president, I got appointed to work in an energy facility within his administration. And we had all kinds of ideas way back then of how to build buildings and do things that were extremely energy efficient. But that all got forgotten over the last few years. So we know a lot of answers. I said this many times in talks, and I haven't said it tonight, so I will again, is that I was trained as a scientist, and I strongly support science. Good science is critical, and the Bush people have abandoned that completely. One of the worst things they've done, what they've done to our science establishment. But in many ways, the solutions to these problems are not scientific. If we can use scientific ideas to do a better job with better windows and better light bulbs and better vehicles that get 80, 90, 100 miles per gallon, of course. But the real things that we need to deal with to solve the problem are political issues, economic issues, and social issues. Those are the things that really we have to think about as we make changes into a sustainable society for the future.
I want to add a couple of things for your benefit. One is to read the book by Paul Hawkins called The Ecology of Commerce. It's a good place to learn about some of those kinds of efforts. But we also, in our College of Technology here in town, a number of courses are offered in green business principles. And Lisa Swallow and Susan Anderson. Susan Anderson we know from the Sustainable Business Council here in town. So if you look on the courses being offered through the College of Technology for courses offered by Lisa Swallow or Susan Anderson, you'll see some of those green business or green enterprise type courses.
I don't want to keep you here forever. How are we doing? Oh, we've got a little more time. Okay.
I have a question along a similar line in that regards. The triple bottom line policy that's being advocated by a lot of businesses in the United States, particularly and the global region, the triple bottom line is exemplified by the new remade Walmart, and that's environment, community, and profits. And seeing in their mass production of organic vegetables and adding organic departments to their walnuts. What's your response to that?
Human nature on the loose. I mean, I don't know what. You're going to get me more pessimistic if you're not careful. I don't know. I mean,
This money, education, it's almost a co-option of everything that we have been doing, or progressives have been doing. And now that's being turned into a money-making venture by those who
Yeah,
remodel it.
don't quote me on this because I need to get reelected this year as Secretary of State of Wisconsin. But I know people who think that the, quote, capitalist system of production and profit may be an antithesis with environmental sustainability. Don't ask what to do about that. I don't even think that electing a Democratic president will change that. That was meant to be facetious. Okay, sir?
Apropos of that, as a desperate optimist, what would you opine about the candidacy of Al Gore?
You mean his past candidacy with the
Future candidacy.
or proposed running again, or which?
Right.
What? What?
Running again.
Yeah. Well, I just heard rumors about that. I wouldn't object to having Al Gore be my president, but I'm not sure he's electable at the moment. We'll have to wait and see. I think he made some serious mistakes in the first election, but he did win, and it was stolen, and there was quite a bit of good stuff written about that. One of my best friends is a journalist, and he went to Florida and spent 4 or 5 months and wrote a book on that election, and it sort of got lost in the tragedy in New York when the planes hit the towers, because his book came out just about then. But he did a really great job of interviewing people and finding out how the election was stolen or how it happened in Florida. So I don't know. I would support him if he was the candidate. I feel similarly about Hillary Clinton. I wouldn't mind if she was my president, but I'm not sure she's electable. And I'm a little upset with some position on the Iraq War recently. She's getting too mushy there. And I think she's better off to take a strong stand. So my candidate at the moment is Russ Feingold, the U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. But I don't know where he'll go with this, but I'm glad he's out there taking very, very principled stands on things, which he does. But it's important. I don't mean to make light of the concept of having a good candidate. I think in all honesty, John Kerry was not a good candidate. He would have been a heck of a lot better president than Bush. He wouldn't have been perfect, but have been, like this. But he wasn't a good candidate, and I don't know why. He never came to me for advice on how to run his campaign. I supported him strongly, but he could have done a better job of getting his message across and talking more succinctly and clearly. I've heard Al Gore speak recently, and he is much better than he was, 7 years ago. Now, will he stay that way if he becomes a candidate? Or will he turn into jello like politicians always do? Way over here.
Do you really think that Russ Feingold is electable on a national level? And if not, who do you think that is actually electable for 2008?
Well, anybody's electable if you work hard enough. And now we're back to the grassroots question again. Are we willing to put aside our individual issues and work as a progressive team of people across this country, religious, women, labor, environment, etc., for the election of much better people? Now, as far as a particular candidate, I don't know at the moment. It's really, there's no obvious candidate. I mean, Hillary Clinton is ahead in the polls because she was First Lady and she's Hillary Clinton and she's raised, $27 million. And unfortunately, people think that money is all that's important, and it is pretty important. But I don't know at this point what's going to happen. No one would have thought that Jimmy Carter would have become president or Bill Clinton would have become president if you'd have looked at it a year or so before. So we could have a total surprise. I mean, the governor of New Mexico might be the next president. It wouldn't be the worst thing either. Sure. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to comment that the outfit in Atlanta that is doing this 100% recycling is a floor covering company. I don't remember the name, but it's in Atlanta.
It's in Atlanta, yeah. Thank you. The company I mentioned is doing the totally recycling carpet is in Atlanta. But my friend here can't remember the name either, but someone will come up with it. Thank you.
A really good source of information on this sort of thing is alternative radio. on National Public Radio on Monday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center has a list of the speakers that have appeared on alternative radio
Alternative radio at 1 o'clock
on Monday.
on Mondays on your local NPR station. Yes, sir.
It feels to me like getting involved with the environmental movement is like getting up in bed on Saturday. Getting up in bed on the environmental movement, like the emotional response to it, to me kind of feels like I have to get up out of bed on Saturday morning. Whereas like being on the other side feels like eating a candy bar. And I don't know, I think that's a pretty significant problem to be going up against a bunch of people who feel like they're eating candy bars.
So your point is that, I mean, to be hard at work on this issue is kind of frustrating and difficult, and just sort of saying, hey, it's going to be okay is easier?
Yeah, well, I mean, it feels good to drive a Hummer, and
Well, there's no question. I mean, we've been sold, I would call a bill of goods on what affluence and happiness is all about. And another problem that my psychology friends tell me, and there's been some interesting surveys that back this up, is that if you tell people long enough that there's a problem, serious problem, and you don't present workable, achievable solutions, they begin to sort of tune out. And that's what's happened to some extent. Now, I don't think it's necessarily our fault being the environmental folks that care, because we have presented solutions, but we haven't had the money and the microphones to get that solution out. So we've been sort of co-opted by the other side, and because of that, people have begun to sort of back away, and that's kind of how we got in this backlash period we're in now. It's much easier to sort of say, well, you know, it's going to be okay. Someone's going to find a whole hell lot of oil someplace, or we're going to come up with nuclear power plants that are safe, you know, and that's a big story right now, which again is propaganda, but we're going to hear a lot more about that in the next few years, because that is a, quote, non-climate change technology, theoretically. So I think your point is valid, and I don't know what we do about it other than just get together like this and support each other, and then try to go out every day with the belief that it's our job to push through that portal of the future as much as we can for the sake of the environment and for our children. And go for nice, beautiful hikes and hold hands with your friends every so often. Let's see, the gentleman here.
Yes, you presented us with some very worrisome statistics about population growth in the United States. I wonder what the implication of your fears is regarding the debate over immigration legislation in the United States.
Yeah. That's a real tricky one, because you have to ask the question, what impact does immigration have on the environment if you're an environmentalist? And there's many other aspects of the immigration issue that relate to jobs and salary and employment and things like that, which are not environmental directly. But from an environmental point of view, it has to do with the level of consumption. One argument is that when people come to this country, it doesn't take them very long to become serious consumers. And new immigrants tend to have more children than long-time U.S. citizens, so that pushes the population as well. The trouble with the issue, I'll be quite honest with you, and I've watched this for years, is that it muddies things. And what is muddying is the difference between immigrants that are fine, decent, hardworking people and mass immigration, where you talk about 2 or 3 or 4 million people a year coming to this country. One can be extremely supportive of immigrants and their rights and protecting them as individuals, which I am, and also say it's not clear that we can absorb 2 or 3 or 4 million people, whether they be from Mexico or Norway. But to make that point clear is very difficult, particularly when you've got a coalition, including the Chamber of Commerces and the Walmarts, who want to exploit labor, and a liberal community that would like to help people who are in poverty. But there are somewhere around 2.5 billion people in the world who are living in poverty worse than the average Mexican is living. And so how do we do anything about that? My position for 20 years has been we need, as U.S. citizens, to be extremely let me start over again, to be much more generous in our support of family planning, women's education, sustainable technology around the world to help people live better and fruitful lives where they live. And that is the only long-term solution. And that's why I'm so critical of administrations like the Bush administration that cut off that kind of foreign aid. And get us involved in these military adventures when we should be trying to build sustainable cultural societies with education programs, particularly for women, because that's a key factor in reducing birth rates, is for women to take power in their countries. These are the things our country should be a leader in, and we've not been. And that's kind of a quick thought on it. Well, you probably want to go home and hold hands with your friends and do something. This gentleman is trying to say something. One more.
It seems like the average person realizes a certain amount of corporate power, but I don't think they really understand the complete stranglehold that multinational corporations have on not only the U.S., but the entire world economy and the control to their own ends that they have.
No, it's true. And that's the whole globalization issue we haven't even talked about. That's a whole semester's course on globalization and the impact of that. And what we do about that. I mean, how we deal with that.
And especially media control along with it.
How do you bring up the standard of living of 3 or 4 billion people to a decent level, convince us that our standard of living, quote unquote, could be improved if we cut back on some of our absurd consumption and have a little cleaner environment and better education and better health care? How do you do that in a society? And there are people that talk about it. I mean, on the climate change issue, there's a school of thought that's been around for more than a decade now called contract convergence, so-called CC. And what their proposal is, and it sounds easy, but it's politically impossible almost, is what we need to do is, here's the United States and here's Bangladesh, okay? We need to contract and converge. Basically, that means we need to bring up the level of consumption in many parts of the world, reduce it in other parts, and at the same time, the net level has got to go down for the Earth to survive. Now, how we can have that contraction, conversion, pronounce that word for me, coming together is a political and economic very difficult situation. And this gentleman is right. I mean, the Exxons and the General Motors and these multinational companies that own everything from yogurt to hot dogs to shoes are very powerful people. The executives are making 60, 70, 80 million dollars a year, and they have tremendous control over our political system. As a politician, I've seen this. I've been running for office and raising money and knocking on doors for 30 years now and helping other people do it. And there's been a real change in our system and it's got a negative feedback loop. I mean, when big money buys politicians do what they want and give them the ability to have more money, which they then invest in the politicians. And it's become a vicious circle the last 20 years in this country, where I used to have spaghetti dinners and people would chip in $20 and I'd raise $1,000 for a campaign to run for state senator. Now politicians call up and say, can you send me 100,000? That's how it works now. So we've gotten totally away from people politics into large financial politics, which has this negative feedback loop. Because the politicians pass the laws to cut the taxes and reduce the regulation, so these people can get richer and richer and richer, so they can give the politicians more money to do what they want. Now, how do we break that cycle? And the only way I know to break it is to take a page out of what Rob Stein has seen and try to take back power. And the most powerful tool we have, to answer your question again, is the grassroots. Because we have quite a bit of money. There are rich people who will help this effort. We have some education ability. And we have a certain amount of ability to work in the media with letters to editor and things like that. But our biggest power is people power. And that's the old-fashioned grassroots politics. Just to toot our horn a little bit, the Sierra Club has a program that's one of my favorite programs. It's called the Building Environmentalist Community. And what that program is, and we're spending all the money we can get you to give us on that program, and we get together with a group of Sierra Clubs in the morning and have a cup of tea and a donut or a nice granola bar if you're into health food. And then we go out as a group, 20 or 30 of us, and knock on doors in our community. And I've done this with Sierra Club people, and I love doing it. I go around the country when I have time, and I join a group of Sierra Club people. I've done it in Olympia, I've done it in Kentucky, I've done it in Philadelphia, I've done it in Charleston, West Virginia, and we say, hi, I'm Doug LaFollette with the Sierra Club, and we're here to talk to you about asthma. We're talking about global climate change. We're talking about Bush's horrible record. And we're doing that now in 25 or 30 communities. And I'd love to have, your community develop a build environmentalist community. You can do it. This gentleman is an active Sierra Club leader, so that's why I pick on him. And your group could do that here. And you could do that, once a month or once every month and go out for 4 hours and you can meet several hundred people, give them some material and talk to them. That's the power we have, and I think that's one of the most potentially useful things that the club that I am the leader of right now is doing. Okay, I wish you a very happy Earth Day every day, all year long, and thank you for having me visit you here.